Welcome back. This is the first of the lessons going to cover material from Chapter 3. Chapter 3 covers cell structure and function. This first mini lesson is just going to cover some characteristics of living things and just review the types of cells, eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. A lot of the information in this might be review from when you took general biology. That's our Bi 211 here at RCC. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So when we take a look at living things, we need to agree upon what is a living thing. So all living things share a certain collection of characteristics that we're going to talk about here. And the little animation that keeps going is just a representation of bacterial growth, which is the first list of processes of life here. Now, when we talk about growth, like in a multicellular organism like humans or cats or whatever, and I will just warn you, I have 2 cats and often you might see them walking around. So just FYI, if you see a tail walking across the screen, that's just a little kitty coming to say hi. Anyway, so in a multicellular organism, growth usually looks like you start with a baby and you grow and grow and grow until you're in adulthood. Well, when you're a single-celled organism like a bacterium, you don't get to a very large size. But growth is still a part of that living characteristic in that it will grow its population. So just like here, we start with a couple cells. Every generation, they multiply and they double their population. This is what we consider bacterial growth or growth for single-celled organisms. That leads into that next bullet point of reproduction. So living things reproduce. They pass on their genetic information to the next generation. For bacteria, they can do that really quickly, hence these quick generation times, because they only have 1 chromosome. Humans have 46 chromosomes that they have to replicate and go through mitosis, and it takes time to divide all those organelles, where bacterial cells are a lot more simple, and so their reproduction happens very quickly. The next process or characteristic of life is responsiveness. So you have to have the ability, if you're a living thing, to respond to stimuli around you and inside of you. So that could be responding to light or heat or chemicals or molecular and chemical communications from other organisms or internal messages, internal signals. So responsiveness is a characteristic of living things and a process of life. The next bullet point here is metabolism. So metabolism is the ability to use energy to break down molecules, releasing energy, using that energy to build molecules. Metabolism includes catabolic pathways and anabolic pathways. It's just the collection of all chemical reactions in living things. Things that don't live usually do not do metabolic processes. Chemical reactions can occur, but they're not in the context of metabolic processes. And then the last one we have listed here is cellular structure. So to be a living thing, minimally you have to have at least 1 cell. And we're going to talk about what cells look like here in the next couple slides. So when we're talking about viruses, right, we got a coronavirus going around right now in our pandemic that we're dealing with. Viruses, for most of the scientific community, are not considered living things. It's still somewhat controversial depending on who you talk to, but according to the characteristics of living things, and you may have seen a similar list in your general biology, me personally, I do not consider viruses living things. They do reproduce. They don't really have metabolism. They grow in population, but they don't have ability to be responsive to their environment, and they don't have a cellular structure. They hijack a host cell and have it carry out its reproduction. But a virus sitting on a counter all by itself is not going to be able to carry out all of these processes of life. So for me, it's not considered a living thing. So the simplest living organisms are consisting of at least 1 cell. All right, so those are our processes of life. Let's take a look at some different cell types. And again, this might be reviewed from what you've learned in the past. There's 2 groupings of cells, 2 kind of categories. If you remember, eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are cells that have a nucleus, a membrane-bound nucleus. That's what the eukaryote means, true nucleus. And prokaryotic cells, pre-nucleus, do not have a membrane-bound nucleus. So that's kind of their defining feature. But along with having a membrane-bound nucleus, eukaryotic cells have a lot of other things too. They're typically larger in size. They have other membrane-bound and membranous organelles like Golgi and endoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria and chloroplasts and lysosomes, and peroxisomes and vesicles, all those fun things you remember learning in general bio. They're larger in size, they're more complex. I have a list. Oh, ribosomes are of a category of what we call ADS. That's going to come into a little bit more play when we get into later chapters. I'm looking at my notes here. Histone bodies, which are proteins that the DNA is associated with. If you remember, DNA is wrapped around these little proteins called histones, kind of makes it look like a beaded chain of DNA. Okay, so those are the characteristics of a eukaryotic cell. At this point, you should be pretty familiar with that concept. And then compare that to a prokaryotic cell, which are a lot smaller and less complex. They do not have membrane-bound organelles, not just no nucleus, but no mitochondria, no chloroplasts, no lysosomes, no Golgi, no endoplasmic reticulum, none of that. They do have a single chromosome that's kind of housed in what's called a nucleoid. It's just kind of a region where the DNA kind of is compressed or compacted, but it's not membranous. There's no phospholipid bilayer surrounding it. They do not have histone bodies associated with their DNA, and they have 70S ribosomes. So there's a slight structural difference between prokaryotic ribosomes and eukaryotic ribosomes. Okay, so I think those are characteristics of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. The size comparison is also, do I have that here? Oh yeah, one more slide. So as far as size comparison goes, we have kind of the largest eukaryotic cell, which is the ostrich egg. It's a egg, just like women have eggs coming out of their ovaries. But just to show you the size comparison between a large-ish protozoa, which is a eukaryotic cell, this is Giardia, a Staphylococcus bacterium, and a varicella virus. I'm going to put in the links. I usually do helpful links for each of the chapters. There is a little interactive website called cellsalive.com, and there's a little link in there called How Big is A? And it's a fun little thing you get to click through and see some, it's kind of like this, but it's a little bit funner. It's interactive, and you can kind of click and see and zoom way in and to see the comparisons of different things, just to see how small the things are that we're going to be talking about in this class in microbiology. And we're going to be pretty much talking about the bacterium and the viruses, mostly bacterium, prokaryotic cells. We do have a chapter on viruses, but it's kind of cool to get a feeling for how these things compare to other things that you may be more familiar with, like red blood cells or pollen or hair, those types of things. Okay, so I will see you next time for our continuation of chapter 3.